Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back for another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Jasmine Crockett. Free speech is not about whatever it is that you all want somebody to say, and the idea that you want to shut down everybody that isn't Fox News is bullshit. And I was supposed to buy Donald Key, and that's crosswords from the Woman in News subreddit. And yeah, people like Jasmine Crockett made me sing a song about free speech now, but during Biden's tenure, they were the same type of person who was all about saying, "Oh, we gotta ban misinformation and hate speech." As I always like to say, it just really depends who's in the in group and who's in the out group. These are frankly empty words from the same type of person who was either fine with or actively clamoring for censorship, for government censorship during the Biden presidency. But now that Trump's president again, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. And yeah, it's pretty much just she's pretty much just another AOC in that regard. Another House Democrat who racial minority female who the millennial who the media won't shut up about. And yeah, eventually you just realize that they're pretty much all just the same thing. When their team does something, it's either they don't talk about it, or it's good. But when the other team does something, it's almost always going to be seen as bad, even if it's the exact same thing. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump signs executive order targeting individual private law firm Jenner and Block for expressly political reasons from WhiteHouse.gov, posted by Maddie O'Clock. And this is another example of that. The progressives were fine with Biden and his administration targeting anyone for expressly political reasons, but the second Trump or anyone in his administration does it, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. Most people don't have principles; they just have teams, and that's increasingly what you see in U.S. politics. It's really just a team sport. When my team hits a home run, it's great, but when your team hits a home run, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. And that's just it's kind of sad seeing the death of principles like this. But that's kind of what happens in this very team-based partisan society that we live in currently. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have the biggest scandal of Trump 2.0 is no scandal at all on MAGA media from CNN.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's a crosspost from the Tuesday subreddit. And yeah, this is another example. The press constantly downplayed Biden scandals. They tried to hide his cognitive decline until they literally couldn't anymore after the June 2024 debate between him and Trump. But when the outgroup media does that and tries to cover up Trump scandals, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. It's these. I'm sorry to be speaking like a broken record here, but it's just all partisanship and team based over having actual principles. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump announces 25% tariffs on all cars not made in the United States from CNBC.com, and that's posted by LegioX. And yeah, I personally don't think that's very good. I'm very anti-tariff, but Redditors were fine with tariffs when Biden was doing them, but when Trump does them, suddenly they're the worst things ever. Biden's tariffs weren't quite as pervasive. His was mainly focused on China in comparison to Trump, who's mainly focused, on pretty much every country. But still, it just goes to show you they don't have principles. They just believe whatever their team does is good, and what the other team does is bad. Then we have Trump signs election order calling for proof of U.S. citizenship to vote, posted by Reuters from Reuters.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. And yeah, I personally, I think you should have proof of citizenship to vote. Personally, I don't think anyone should be voting at all. I think, voting is inherently forced collectivism. What we need is voluntary collectivism rather than forced collectivism. But, the state ultimately does have the authority to decide who doesn't get the vote, because they ultimately are the ones counting the votes. So that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Yale professor who studies fascism fleeing U.S. to work in Canada from TheGuardian.com, hosted by Maddie O'Clock. And yeah, this is just another Doomer Reddit post. Trump's first term, I personally don't really like him, but his first term didn't result in a fascist dictatorship. I personally don't think his second will either. If I tell average redditor, you cope through his first term, you can cope through his second term as well. But Reddit's just propaganda at this point, and this guy seems to have believe all of it. So if you want to believe that Trump's going to be literally Hitler, you've been saying that for pretty much a decade at this point. If you want to think he's Hitler, that's fine. But, eventually, it's the boy who cried wolf. It's the Redditor who cried Trump is Hitler. That's one of the things to say. It's either that or Trump is a Russian asset, or, anyone who dissents at all is a Russian asset, Nazi, fascist, or whatever buzzwords they want to throw at you. If they want to say that, that's fine. That's freedom of speech. And if you want to move out of the country because you think it's turning into a fascist dictatorship, that's fine. Justify doing whatever you want to. But, eventually, when you yell the same thing over and over again for a decade, almost over a decade at this point, eventually people are going to stop listening. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have when efficiencies in reducing the size of government are actually just about punching people who didn't vote for you, from Reddit.com. That's from Health Eating, and that's crosswords from the Data is Beautiful subreddit. And that's Doge preferentiality, canceled grants and contracts for recipients in counties that voted for Harris. And yeah, ultimately, that's kind of what government is, I would say. It's punishing your enemies and rewarding your friends. But and when Trump does that, it's the worst thing ever. But when Biden does that, it's entirely justified or a good thing. And that's very much, I keep saying it. But, it's just true. It's just really who's in the in-group, who's in the out-group. Then we have, this is the representative from my state, one of the few that are brave enough to fight back against MAGA, from Ragnar OKXG, and that's a crosswords from the Santa Fe subreddit, Representative Melanie Stansbury. You think that the American people voted for you to waste their time on refrigeration standards. How is that true of the American people? And yeah, I personally don't really care for refrigeration standards or any government-enforced regulations, but regardless, I think, I really don't care for any representatives grandstanding on the on the House floor, regardless of what party they are or who they're standing up against, I would say. And yeah, these days it seems like a lot of House representatives just want to be social media personalities like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or Jasmine Crockett, rather than actually govern. But if people want to say, oh, she's standing against MAGA, this is the greatest thing ever, they should be able to do so. But I personally don't really care what the elected officials say. If they want to grandstand and yell about MAGA bad, yada yada yada, or woke bad, yada yada yada, they should be able to. But I really don't care anymore. Just I can get the same thing on social media for free from non-representatives. Why should I care if someone's a representative or not? They can pass laws, but increasingly, it doesn't matter who passes laws or what's written in the laws. It matters how they are enforced, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Tesla is suing to open dealerships in Wisconsin, the state where Elon Musk is spending heavily to influence judicial elections, from Fortune.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And then they added, he bought a president, why not some judges? And yeah, personally, I think Tesla should be able to open up a dealership wherever it wants to. But if they want to, if the state wants to fight that and Tesla wants to have lawsuits against that, I think they should be able to. This user is definitely one of the ones who has a lot of r/politics brain rot. I personally think he occasionally does go against the official right narrative. Like I remember he said Daniel Penny, the guy who killed that Jordan Neely, I think, that was causing the scene, was a hero. But these days, they all seem to be Elon bad, Trump bad, and not much beyond that. And yeah, it's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Not only is the password on Hegseth's Russian email address the same as his verified personal Gmail account, but it's for the phone verification number for the Russian email is a +7 country code Russia. Why does Hegseth have a Russian phone number? And that's a tweet from Antidote, and that was posted by Ragnar Casey, and that's crossed from the Anything Goes news subreddit. And yeah, I think it's interesting he has a Russian phone number, but I really don't care at this point. They've been saying Trump colluded with Russia for years, and maybe he was, but after you're screaming it for 10 plus years, eventually you don't really care anymore. If they want to collude with Russia and have Russian phone numbers, that's on them. You just can't scream Russia, Russia, Russia 24/7 and still have people believe you. They were. That's why they said, oh, the Mueller report's going to completely take down Trump. But there was really nothing in it to take him down, and now this is just another one of those things. Eventually you catch on to nothing ever happens, and you just have to cope with it. Then we have Elon Musk makes request to Reddit CEO to take down posts he didn't like for posted by Ninja Lover from Mashable.com. And they added, all that other stuff is great. He's good on some things. It's not all a grift. The word is overused anyway. He should be celebrated for stuff and reasons. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Elon Musk asking the Reddit CEO to censor things because it was against the rules. But, if he wants to justify doing that, that's fine. This user has had me censored from this subreddit for months now, because, you broke the rules. But when Elon does the exact same thing, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. These people don't have principles. They just have, they just have their own, agendas. And that agenda usually is out-group bad, in-group good. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump administration now going after the Smithsonian and other institutions from WhiteHouse.gov, posted by Swampyanky Dan. And that's a crossword from the Law subreddit. And yeah, this is another Orange Man bad post. Ultimately, he's in control of the Smithsonian right now, whether you like it or not. If I didn't hear anyone complaining about Biden being in control of the Smithsonian for 4 years, but suddenly Trump is, and it's the worst thing ever. Then we have Australia MP Adam Bent labels Trump a dangerous demagogue, calls him Canberra to sever its alliance with Washington from Donald Key, and that's crossword from the World 24x 7-hour subreddit. And yeah, if Australia wants to sever its alliance with Washington, that's fine. But I think it's all talk. It's been a decade. Nothing's really changed since Trump first announced he's running for president in regard to international relations too much, despite what Reddit and other social media would have you believe. So, believe whatever you want to, but, nothing's ever really going to change, regardless of which figurehead is in the White House. Then we have Ron Paul. Beware the slippery slope to the Gestapo. Freedom of speech is not granted by the government. Non-citizens in America have freedom of speech, and that's a tweet for Ron Paul from X.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's crossword from the We the Fifth subreddit. And yeah, I would agree with that. But Reddit didn't care about freedom of speech when Biden came after it when he pressured social media companies to censor content. But now that Trump's doing the same thing in regards to anti-Israel protests, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. I personally don't really care for any censorship that comes from the government or private individuals like Ninja Lover here. But these people, they only care about when censorship comes from the opposite side rather than their own side most of the time. And that's my thoughts there. And see if there's anything new. And looks like there isn't, so we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.